Okay, hello. Thank you for joining this hour, which is the second of a three-part series on leveraging African pension funds for housing finance in Africa. My name is Kader Ben Brahim, and I will be your moderator for this session. We're very this webinar series together with our partners from the Center for Affordable Housing Finance. For joined us in the first webinar a few months back, you will recall that the discussion focused on looking at the pensions industry in key African markets in terms of regulation, assets under management, investment portfolios, with a particular focus on housing. Okay. Webinar, we'll now turn our attention to explore the opportunities and challenges in the affordable market in Africa, which is why we're very pleased to have with us today Serena Rampersad. Serena is a research specialist with the Center for Affordable Housing Finance. So very pleased to have Pamela Lamoureux join us as a discussant. After the presentation. Pamela is Head of Investor Relations with the International Housing Solutions. For of you who don't know, IHS is a global private equity firm that it leads in investments in the affordable housing sector in sub-Saharan Africa. Also today is, as a discussant, is Femi Adewale. So Femi serves as the managing director with Shelter Afrique. Shelter Afrique is a Pan-African finance institution created to support the development of African real estate and the housing sector. So both Pamela and Femi will be sharing with us their experience engaging with pension funds to invest in the affordable housing in Africa. So into the main subject for today's discussion, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour. We'll do our best to keep it to that time, bearing in mind, of course, your respective schedules. To ensure that quality for all participants will be muted. So only the presenters and discussants will have microphone rights for today's webinar. However, you will be able to submit your questions to us either through the chat feature or the Q&A box, which you should be able to see on the right side of the screen. Yeah. If you do have any technical issues or if anything funny appears in your screen, please you can simply message our administrator, MFW4A Secretariat, for any issues. My colleagues stand by and we'll make sure that you'll get the support that you need. Slides and recording of the session will be circulated to all registered participants after the session. Then last but not least, please do allow the short survey that appears after the session appear as a pop-up once the webinar is over, and it will really allow us to get your feedback in terms of how we can improve our your webinar experience, and also to get your ideas for possible talks in future sessions. Okay, and then finally, please feel free to share, exchange on social media. So what you see on this slide is the hashtag Housing Pensions Africa, also the Twitter handles for MFW4A and for Center for Affordable Housing Finance. In an effort to save some time, I will not be introducing Making Finance Work for Africa nor the CAF in this session. However, those of you who are unfamiliar about our work, I would then encourage you to check out our websites, which you can see on this slide. What to do now is I will give a brief overview on our strategic partnership between Making Finance Work for Africa and Center for Affordable Housing Finance. So we both have a shared interest in deepening the housing finance markets in Africa. The objective of this partnership is mainly focused on two things: exploring innovations in housing development and finance, and also supporting the housing finance market developments through a number of activities that we have planned, including work groups and setting up investment vehicles. Also going to be using case studies, joint case studies, and knowledge briefs on various topics in housing finance. And of course, this webinar series is just one of those joint activities that we'll continue doing. So what we'll do now actually is just to give a quick recap on some of the main messages that came out of the webinar of the series. For those who attended the first webinar, I do apologize if this will sound a little repetitive. I'll not to delve too much in this segment, but I do think, however, that it's important to at least go through some of the main messages just to bring in some context to this discussion. So for those of you who attended, it might be also a good refresher. So as I mentioned earlier, what we tried to do in the last webinar was to take stock of the pensions industry in Africa to really sort of get a sense of what is happening and why is this interest in the African pensions industry and investments. So the main attributes that really jumps out immediately is the remarkable growth of pension funds' assets under management in the last 10 years. And fueled by a number of factors, which we have grouped here four boxes. So actually in the regulatory environment, we have seen a lot of movements towards privatization of pension funds management across the continent. We have also seen mandatory retirement contributions in some countries, and this effectively meant moving more people moving into the pensions net. Also seen pension funds change their asset mix and expand their allocation to alternative assets. That we will talk about maybe in a little more detail later on when I will look into the case of Kenya. In terms of demographics, I mean, what stands out, obviously, it's the growing young population. In fact, I mean, Africa has the youngest population in the world. And this, as a result, is leading to steady increase in pension contributions and more and more people enter the workforce. The macroeconomic situation is a major factor that is contributing to the increase in the asset under management. It's mostly driven by prudent fiscal policies, but also a surge for higher yields, especially in the low interest environment. And we have already mentioned alternative assets, and we're seeing really more awareness of these new asset classes. Do not necessarily fall under traditional classes of assets like cash, stocks, or bonds. So we're talking about private equity, REITs, derivatives, venture capital, and a lot. And so what really stands out of these asset classes are their attributes in terms of their long-term nature, the diversification benefits that it provides, scalability, also inflation hedging. So we're seeing more and more pension funds investing in this asset class. Too much about this slide, but what we hear is an illustration of where the pension funds are investing. So we gave an example of Nigeria, where about 70% of its allocation is invested in government securities. We typically see that in many countries in Africa, where many pension schemes have the largest allocation in fixed income, government securities, and to a lesser extent, quoted equities. And also the least allocation going to private equity, venture capital, and REITs. Of course, what's interesting is that the investments in these traditional assets have also contributed to the overall growth of the assets under management. So it's not necessarily all that bad. It does also help the benchmark yield curve. Investments in bond guarantees also are long-term and provide liquidity through their coupon payments. So, give back that really all that pension funds care about. Well, no, I mean, pension funds do care about the security of their returns, and given interest rate levels in countries, it's no reason why we see securities as an attractive investment. So in this, we summarize some of the main barriers that we came across in our work with respect to pension funds and long-term investment. I'll briefly mention some of them. Regulation is often quite a topic that is brought up time and time again. In terms of how restrictive it is to invest in certain sectors and assets. This is true in many cases. Well, this is true in many cases, especially in the past, where there was no guidelines to invest in these alternative assets. But what we're now is sort of a change in pattern and opening up of new opportunities, really, that are going to be exploited. We talked about the monetary policy and the high bond yields, which becomes really a benchmark not only in terms of returns, but also risk profile. The knowledge is a key factor. We're often seeing a lack of familiarity or awareness of relevant markets in especially sectors and products. When it comes to investing in assets like housing, or housing, for example, it would require different valuation strategies, and also requires knowledgeable fund managers to expose the pension funds to more risks. And then the absence of data, of course, is something that we see across the board. Absence of data in terms of market size, in terms of benchmarking and performance. So a lot of times these pension industries are very nascent and really don't have the track record to justify their investments. In the last webinar, we also had the opportunity to dive deeper into two countries, Kenya and Ghana. Kenya, we had learned a great deal about their investments and developments, having had the pleasure to bring in Dr. Uma from the Retirement Benefits Authority. Learned initially in Kenya there was no provision for funds to invest in alternative assets until new regulations were introduced in 2016 to expand the asset class. Since this new regulation, we have seen a gradual increase in asset allocation, particularly to REITs and private equity. And there were many factors that contributed to change in asset mix. As a year, we have seen a huge growth in AUM. There's that in combination with a more liberalized regimes introduced in the CMA, the Capital Markets Authority, and the Retirement Benefits Authority. All of it possible really to invest in alternative assets. Others that contributed to the contributed to investments in alternative assets is the changing market conditions. And there was a push to really provide higher yields for retirees. In terms of opportunities to invest in housing, they exist in the form of immovable property, up to 30% of the portfolio allocation. Be invested in bonds, and this, by the way, is opportunities to invest in housing. So they also exist in mortgage bonds, and up to 20% of the portfolio allocation for that. We mentioned that they introduced REITs as a new asset class under capital market licensing, and they can invest up to 30% in the class. Another interesting development we've seen in Kenya is the government's Big Four agenda. It's focusing on four areas: affordable housing, Medicare, manufacturing, and food security. All of this is also related to a recent introduction of a new asset class in the form of debt instruments through public-private partnership. And this asset class, really, the government is hoping to enable pension schemes to invest in the affordable housing. Of course, there were also issues that they faced, where the investments were focused in the high end of the market as opposed to the lower income segments when it came to housing. We also took a look at Ghana, where we've had the pleasure to talk to Mrs. Nelson Kofi from the Social Security and National Insurance Trust Fund. So it have committed to housing as far back as in the 1970s. They were mainly residential accommodations for contributors. Behind that was mostly geared towards providing social benefits to workers, so that they got decent housing, and also in turn they'll provide income generation for the fund. So the allocation was mainly to employers, who in turn rent them out to their employees. So over the years, apparently this arrangement was not very successful, and so in the end they decided to do an outright sale to recoup most of their investments. Got into a number of issues in terms of high maintenance costs. Even after these buildings were sold, there were issues regarding to the limits on the rentals. They couldn't raise the rent. The lesson that they learned is that often they would move into areas where there is no bulk infrastructure, and so SNITs had to the cost of electricity, water, road networks, and ultimately had an impact on the final cost of the houses, which really became unaffordable for the low-income earners. Okay, there. I will now turn to Serena, who will be housing market dynamics in Africa. So Serena, it's on.
Thank you, Abdul Qadir, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Serena Ramprasad from the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa. And today, this afternoon, I'll quickly take you through an overview of Africa's housing markets based on CAF's research and our understanding, and then how do we leverage the opportunity for affordable housing through understanding the risks that are imperative in the market. So the key factors that we find that is imperative for driving investment into affordable housing. Is based approach. So ways that CAF approaches understanding housing markets is through the provision of research, collection of data, and speaking to stakeholders, so that the lack of market insight increases the risk deemed with investment in the sector. So this graph really just shows you the depth of backlogs across countries in Africa. There's such a great need and demand for housing, and this varies across all countries. Urbanization and population dynamics also have huge consequences in Africa, and as well as a shortage for affordable housing supply. Next, please. So on this slide, at the bottom, you'd see, if you had to Google what residential real estate in Africa looks like, you get images of your high income, really fancy, expensive housing. So what CAF does is we want to understand what does the affordable sector look like, and how is housing delivered in Africa. So we found four approaches, being developer-built, government-built, self-built through incremental housing delivery, as well as slums. Next, please. aspect factors that broadly characterize African housing markets today include, can you click for the pop-up, please? One being informality and tenure insecurity, which seems to drive investment away as it's deemed too risky, yet this is a reflection of market inefficiencies. 60% of Africa's urban population live in slums, and housing investment left behind urbanization by 9 years. So insecurity supports informal and exploitative transactions, heightens risk for both financiers and households. It's important to note that in order for housing to be taken up, it needs to be in the financing available. While some financiers are wary of land not having formal tenure, others, like First National Bank, recognize communally owned land as a form of tenure to be used as collateral. Okay, so just characteristics of informality and tenure insecurity is that the majority of urban housing is built by households by one, and most housing bought with cash. The second factor is the existing urban rental stock and the opportunity for investment into that. For between 30 and 50% of urban populations rent. In Tanzania, for example, over 50% rent, urban households rent in Dar es Salaam, and similarly in Abidjan with 78% renting. So some of the characteristics of existing rental stock is most are one bedrooms within a larger property, mainly overcrowded, and this is because of a lack of supply to meet the demand of the market. More often than not, rental units have access to services, and a minority have full access. Factor of new build. More than not, investors target the higher end of the market, with vacant units because market segmenting and not responding to current market needs. For example, the state pension funds are beginning to look at housing as an investment target. Some governments as well to promote affordable housing and the social good, but are targeting the right market. I mean, if we look at examples like Vision City in Rwanda, it was built by a state pension fund, and the units were initially priced between $100,000 and $500,000 US. And after some time, the prices were slashed because this was completely unaffordable to the majority of the population. Based on some of CAF's calculations, 2% of the population in Rwanda can afford a $20,000 house at current lending rates. The initial 100 to 500,000 was completely misunderstood. The market was misunderstood. And another example being Kilamba in Angola, where the entry-level units were priced between 190,000 US to 220, and they were called affordable, but really no one could afford that. And development of 20,000 units was almost empty, and the government had to intervene and reduce prices and lower mortgage interest rates. And then lastly, we have the factors insufficient scale. This means there's not enough housing being built to target the appropriate market segments. For example, Shelter Afrique estimates that outside of South Africa, there are almost no developers who can sustain an annual delivery of more than 500 units. Next, please. These factors there, for CAF to understand this better, we take a value chain approach to understanding where the bottlenecks exist, to understand risks so that these can be addressed and managed with investors across the public and private sector. Value chain we look at goes from land assembly right to the value chain until looking at tenure, title, bulk infrastructure, house construction, and social and economic infrastructure. Please click on the slide. Some of the examples of, you can continue to click on. Examples of the key risks and issues along the value chain is one, the access to well-located land. More than not, that land is very expensive, which pushes housing development out into the periphery. And these examples can be seen in Luanda through the Kilamba example, which located 30 km from the city center, close to far from economic opportunities, and sometimes takes people 2 hours to get to work even. And this has many implications of the socioeconomic aspects and living conditions. Examples would be the title and tenure. Tiny mortgage markets exist because it is not secured. So banks will not lend if there's no collateral to take up against the loan, for example. And then without secure tenure, there's housing investment by households who fear eviction, lead to slums, and so on. In terms of your bulk infrastructure, which is supposed to be delivered by local government, there's an underinvestment and failure to provide infrastructure, and this leads to higher cost of housing, poorer networks, and high cost of building materials. Pushes investment away. If you look at housing construction, the lack of or high cost of developer financing and long-term funding leads to small housing projects and limits affordability, making housing expensive, and then forcing households to build incrementally using substandard material, which affects the quality of housing development. And then end-user finance, for example, is highly dependent on the macroeconomic health of the country, and this impacts the lending terms in terms of loan terms, size, and cost. Next slide, please. So just a quick graph showing some of the CAF's data that we collect through our yearbook process, and we survey countries across the continent to understand how much does housing cost. So just trying to understand across the value chain what consequence does it have for the cost of housing. And here are just some data points telling you how expensive housing is and comparing it from 2016 to 2017. Next, please. So using this data in terms of the cost of the cheapest newly built house, so CAF collects this data across the continent, so what's the cost of the cheapest newly built house in each country, and then to understand how much of or what segment of the population or percentage of the population can afford the cheapest newly built house. And you see in DRC, Mozambique, and South Sudan that only 1% of the urban population can afford this cheap newly built house. It means that we're not responding to the correct market segments. Next slide, please. The cost of the house is a critical factor in terms of the supply side and what's being developed. And then the cost of mortgage financing and lending is also very important in terms of creating affordable housing development. Next. Really just to illustrate the impact that housing has on the economy on the prime, secondary, and tertiary sectors. So, for example, the input factors that we've seen in value chain, your land and infrastructure, your end-user construction finance, your building materials, are all inputs into supply of a house. And this influences the price and scale of the supply, all within macroeconomic and financial sector framework, into municipal bylaws, policy, and strategy. This, in turn, influences demand for inputs into a finished house. And, for example, furniture, appliances are needed for that, and that creates a multiplier effects in the economy and a need for more skilled and technical labor. And this, the economy and production, can you click again, please? This in turn affects, you can see on the graph, job creation and employment, increased municipal rate base, so the municipalities have more money to deliver on creating an enabling environment, and then production as a whole. So this just largely says what the significance of housing on the economy largely, and the multiplier effects of that. Next, please. In an attempt to understand new and innovative tools of investment, CAF commissioned research on real estate investment trusts. How have these been applied in the African context? The aim was to investigate the potential of such instruments to increase investment potential into affordable housing across Africa. So, new in Africa and the promulgation of legislation and this has only happened over the past 3 to 5 years. We looked at a few case studies in Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and while South Africa is leading with 30 different REITs, the concept has been applied in other countries. Tanzania, for example, has the Watumishi Housing Company, which is a REIT that began in 2015. So it's important to mention that is because the Watumishi Housing Company REIT is largely funded by pension funds for the development of affordable housing. So together with the development of commercial properties, the Watumishi Housing Company REIT aims to mobilize funding for development of low to middle income housing for both sale and for rent, and target house prices between $10,000 and $40,000 US, with $20,000 US considered the sweet spot according to Tanzanian Invest. This piece of research is available on as well, so you can have a more in-depth look at that. Other research that we have underway that's related is rental housing, and I'll take you now to the housing investment landscape. So another study recently undertaken by CAF is to understand the landscape of investment across each region of the continent. So we started with the East African community, we moved to Central Africa, then Southern, North, and Western regions, and they're all available on our website. But the study really is to quantify the breadth of investment activity, who's investing, how much are they investing, and what's the scope of large-scale investment in the region. This setting out the landscape of investment for both local and foreign institutional investors. Local institutional investors, banks, capital markets, and pension funds. I'm just picking on the pension funds. The pension funds have provided over $100 million US in medium-term loans to commercial banks in East Africa for mortgage lending. Then in terms of foreign institutional investors, please change the slide. So that investor interest is there, but it's tentative. So this slide shows us that the majority of foreign investors that have invested in housing in the East African region between the period 2000 and 2017 were development finance institutions. All these institutions' focus on housing was driven by very real commitment, impact potential of the sector. The hesitancy is also evident in the scale of development. So the slide basically shows us that an estimated $40 billion was invested by 20 foreign institutional investors into the East African region, and of this, only 10% was allocated to investments in housing. Off in more detail, it basically gives you an understanding of the organizations that have been investing, with China, Exim Bank investing the most. Next slide, please. Funding from institutions were targeted at a range of activities, including equity, lines of credit to expand mortgage lending, construction finance for developers, feasibility studies, credit guarantees, technical assistance, and so on. But here again, this slide is just showing us the share across countries in the East African region, and you can see here that Kenya has the most attention, followed by Tanzania. And then two of the main challenges that exist in deepening and broadening investment into the East African region we found were cost of investor funds and information asymmetry in the housing finance markets in the region. Well, these two are related. In the absence of sound data that accurately quantifies both the risk and opportunities, investors hedge their bets and look for higher returns. Next slide, please. So this slide basically shows the CAF collects on the cheapest newly built house, and I've shown you the slide before, this graph on the left of the percentage of urban households who can afford the cheapest newly built house. So what we're saying here is that if housing was delivered at, for example, $7,500 in the Millet Fuller Foundation does in Nigeria, that of households that can be served is to an estimated 52 million urban households across the continent. And look at the graph on the right, and you see the color variations. And if you compare, for example, in only 19% could afford the cheapest newly built house in country, but if you buy a house of $7,500, 78% could afford it, as opposed to 19%. That's an illustration, and the next slide will take us through what the possibilities in terms of impact could be by building at scale cheaper housing. Mention that if all countries delivered a $7,500 house, this could lead to 52 million urban households across Africa being served, and this could mean 400 billion US dollars of economic activity, multiplier effects, and just to illustrate that impact. Next slide, please. So in terms of rental that we mentioned before as one of the key factors characterizing African housing markets, CAF is busy collecting data on rental markets, and this is really for us to understand what the rental market looks like, quantify the market, and understand the opportunity and risks, as rental is seen as an investment opportunity. Next slide, please. All mean. So in terms of investors needing to access scale, while affordability needs to be broken down into segments, 4 key approaches of the opportunity exist in African housing markets, and these can be seen by 1, housing microfinance and incremental construction, and this is really breaking up the housing value chain and segmenting the market with well-structured financial products to respond to the needs. Vehicles, which are your savings schemes, your community savings schemes, and housing cooperatives. Some vehicles that aggregate household affordability, provide proposition, engage as developers in local projects away from your mainstream mortgage lending. Thirdly, we have real estate investment trusts. These investment vehicles aggregate investments and investors into realizable deals. With real estate investment trusts, institutional investors don't exactly need to understand the market with being able to play that function and do all that research and develop accordingly. So that sort of takes away the risk from investors in terms of understanding the market. And if we look at rental, this is a housing supply approach that aggregates the management function, amortizes the asset costs, and enables small-scale household landlordism. And this has significant impact for what that could mean for the economy. And with that, I think I'm done. There's so much of information that CAF could provide you with. So if there are any questions, feel free to contact me or any of my colleagues. And my details are supposed to be up. my colleague Nalu taking you through the question answer session, and she's from the African Union of Housing Finance, to which CAF is the secretariat for. With that said, we'd like to say that our view, market knowledge is the first step in building the business case for investment, so that better investment decisions are made through market segmenting and targeting better product development and understanding risks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Serena, for this very interesting presentation. I will, by the way, I will put the contact details at the end of this presentation. So you have to run, catch a plane. So thank you very much again for this very insightful contribution. And I'd like to also welcome Nolu Ncha from the African Union for Housing Finance, who will be also on standby to answer any questions you might have in the Q&A segment. Okay, so we will now move into the discussion part of the webinar. So Pamela, I will start with you. So International Housing Solutions, they managed successful exits of a number of projects. I think one of them that comes to mind is the South African Workforce Housing Fund, and that committed to the development of around 28,000 units for low and middle income families. And you get pension funds also to invest in the process. So I want to ask you, could you maybe talk a little bit about sort of your engagement with the pension funds, and what type of opportunities do you see available for pension funds to invest in affordable housing? So Pamela?
Everyone, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I'm very happy to be a part of this and share a little bit of the experience. South Africa Workforce Housing Fund was our first fund, and that was closed in 2008. So being a 10-year fund, we are finalizing and closing out that fund this year in 2018. That was our first fund, and that was obviously the first foray into using private equity focused solely on affordable housing in South Africa. This sort of the first private equity fund of that nature. So we were very concerned about whether we'd be able to get the investors. We had OPIC funding for debt participation, and we have OPIC in both of our funds. And so we then needed to go out and raise the equity portion. So very quickly, we were able to bring on a very large Canadian pension fund. And they ended up being the anchor investor in the fund and ended up taking up about 46% of the fund. And it was very interesting because while they had a very, very large real estate portfolio, it was all in developed markets. And it was in Canada and North America and very developed markets. And so they were looking for an opportunity to get into emerging markets, and particularly were interested to understand residential lending in Africa. So they saw our fund as a very good opportunity to learn about the challenges and the risks and the opportunities of real estate in Africa. Now, certainly South Africa was a very interesting country for them to take that first step, because they saw South Africa as fairly developed in terms of other African countries and other emerging markets. They were very impressed with the legal framework that was already in place in South Africa. We have a strong financial sector and banks to work with for both the debt financing for the projects as well as the mortgage financing side. And just a very strong building sector commitment, very strong standards from the government. We had good EAs, we had good environmental management plans and health and safety specs, all things that made them think that these were the kind of properties that they could get comfortable investing with the first sort of foray into Africa investment. So soon after bringing the Canadian Pension Fund, we were able to bring in PIC, the Public Investment Corporation in South Africa, through the Government Employee Provident Fund scheme. And of course, they were just very keen to support South Africa, and housing and affordable housing in South Africa. So it was a very good fit for them. So our first fund, over 50% of the equity we raised was from pension funds because we were a first fund. We were not really able to go to the DFIs. We didn't have a track record, so we were fairly limited. Now, since then, in 2017, we closed our second fund, which is IHS Fund 2, and the landscape was very different at that time. Now, going in Fund 2, we had targeted pension funds specific, where in Fund 1, we just wanted to raise the equity. We didn't particularly have a strategy for any kind of investor type. But in Fund 2, we really felt that the pension funds would be a really attractive source of equity because of all the things that Abdul and Serena had talked about, the legal, regulatory, the changes, the sort of getting to know more about. But very interesting to see how the landscape had changed so differently from 2008 when we raised our first fund to, in the late, say 2015, 2016, when we started raising capital for our second fund. The interest of the investors, including the pension funds, had shifted. While return on capital is still very important, a key consideration. Also another very key consideration was the social and environmental impact, and so so there was two really fundamental differences. So Fund 1 was about $230 million. Fund 2 is about $270 million. So we have about $500 million of assets under management. And as Abdul said, we did about 30,000 units in Fund 1 for both rent and for sale, with a large percentage of that for rental, for affordable rental. And now we're starting to place our Fund 2, which are $270 million. Now, there were two big fundamental differences between Fund 1 and Fund 2. Fund 1 was all South Africa, so all our investments are 35 projects. All the developers were South Africa projects. In Fund 2, we have two sleeves. One that's for South Africa, which is about 75% of the fund, and one that's for Sub-Saharan Africa, which is about 25% of the fund, and focused primarily on Namibia and Botswana at this time as the Sub-Saharan countries outside of South Africa. And so investors that were looking at Fund 2 came with a really different mandate. They really wanted funds, a manager who had a strong governance, had strong social environmental management systems in place, had the capacity to report and monitor and quantify these impacts for these investors. And the other big change between Fund 2 in expanding out of South Africa was that we began to implement the IFC Green Edge tool. So the majority of the units that we create in Fund 2 will also be green. And again, that became a very important aspect, and particularly for pension. So with Fund 2, we have one pension fund that's in the South African sleeve. That's the Eskom Provident Fund, who has about 5% of the equity in that sleeve. And we have in the Sub-Saharan sleeve, we have the Government Institutions Provident Fund in Namibia, who is a 26% shareholder of the equity in that sleeve. And obviously can only invest in projects that we're doing in Namibia, and they are also going to be green projects. So with that, it gives you an overview of what we've done with the pension funds in the two funds that we're currently, the two affordable housing funds we're currently managing.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Sorry, I think I lost the. I do apologize. I think I just lost my control of the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you very much for this overview. I appreciate. I think there's a lot of food for thought here in terms of how we can leverage pension funds for investment in affordable housing. I'm very mindful for time, so I will try to now give the panel to Femi. Femi, I suppose I'll ask you the same question. I know that Shelter Afrique has issued some housing development bonds to finance housing across the continent. Could you perhaps maybe talk a little bit about your experience in if you engage with the pension funds, and also where do you think the business case is to invest in this area? So Femi.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for inviting us onto this. So I'm just going to go very quickly into this. Shelter Afrique has been financing affordable housing across the continent for about 34 years now. So whereas we're not direct...
Sorry, Femi, I have to interrupt you here. I do apologize, but the voice seems to be... it's not very clear.
Okay.
Could you perhaps maybe try to adjust your microphone?
Okay, let's see what I can do.
Oh, go ahead. You can continue. I'm told that you sound good, so it's on my end. I'm sorry.
Right, that's fine. And primarily, the Shelter Afrique's business model is really a financial intermediary lending into private and public sector developers of affordable housing. For the large part of the company's history, most of capital has from shareholder funds. Over the last 10 years, in response to significant demand for capital to finance a growing program of affordable housing projects across sub-Saharan Africa, we to find alternative sources of capital. And some of that has come from DFIs, but on the whole, about 60% to 70% in the last couple of years is come from bond issues on local markets, particularly currently the Kenyan capital markets and the in Abidjan. Both markets to date, we have raised just over $250 million. In that particularly, we have issued 5 papers, and hopefully we'll be going to the market again over the next couple of years. Our experience, if take, for example, the Kenyan experience in terms of who is buying our papers. In Kenya, about 60% of the paper are being bought by local pension funds. The balance of that is obviously asset managers who are managing investment for high net worth individuals. But about 60% is being bought by private and public pension fund managers, particularly in Kenya. The Social Securities Fund has been a major buyer. The piece is slightly different in French West Africa, where we've also issued papers to date, in the sense that there we have seen very lower level of participation by pension funds compared to what we have in East Africa. Questions about what is the business case? The reality that and I think the role that organizations like Shelter Afrique plays, and I think that this is quite significant in giving pension funds a business case for putting money in housing, it's not a good story to tell, but the reality is that the affordable housing market and some of the data come out of the CAF studies suggest that it still presents a very high risk asset class for most pension funds. Even estate investment funds are really struggling to raise capital funds across the continent, perhaps outside the South and the Maghreb states. I think what we have tried to do is to intermediate that relationship, the Delta Africa balance sheet and track record on the line, so that the security for the pension funds is actually shelter of it rather than the deployment of the capital itself. I think that in seeking to, in the first stage of this cycle, in seeking pension funds to feel comfortable about deploying their growing capital into housing, and part of what needs to be done is looking to create a lot more intermediaries to shield pension funds from the high and complicated risks that are still very inherent in the affordable housing market. I think as over the years we make progress in improving the risk profile of that sector, I think it then becomes possible to lift that veil. But our projection is that over the next decade or so, I think that a big strategic approach is creating an area of strong intermediaries that can receive capital from pension funds and manage and feel more comfortable manage those risks that continue to exist in the affordable housing and the almost informal nature of the market. And that is the strategy it has adopted and continues to adopt. It is extremely high risk, and perhaps as a development fund institution, we could do that. But it provides an outlet for pension funds to put their money into affordable housing and get safe and strong returns without necessarily to take on the direct risks. Perhaps take any questions.
Okay, very much, Femi, for this great overview. We are right now, in fact, just to explain a little bit, I've had to change computer stations, so unfortunately I have missed a big chunk of your presentation, but okay. What we'll do now is we'll move to the Q&A part of the discussion, and I think I'll just probably maybe go to a question to Pamela. You mentioned in your second, when you raised your second fund, that it was a completely different approach, obviously, and it was mainly targeted to pension funds. And could you maybe give a little bit in terms of your strategy, now that you've incorporated the IFC's green, what's it called? Yes. Was that something that attracted the targeted investors that you used?
Yeah, definitely. And I should clarify that while we had a strategy from the very beginning to approach a number of pension funds, we went globally. We went all over the world looking at various pension funds that had interest in Africa. We ended up, with two pension funds, and we have 75% of funding came from the DFIs. Now, as I mentioned, we didn't have a track record with our first fund. With our second fund, we were coming with well-established fund manager with IHS. We had set up our own property management company. So we had very strong asset management. We had a strong social environmental management system in place because with the second fund, we brought in KfW, IFC, the Global Environmental Fund, which is managed by IFC, and EIB. So they brought, a very high level of ESMS, guidelines and but also brought a very high sense of a very credible investor base. So while we were focused and spent a lot of time, and I should also mention it takes the pension funds quite a long time to go through the due diligence process because in most cases they outsource it to a very credible due diligence company that does the analysis for them. So with the internal and external communication that has to go on, it does take quite a long time to get through the process of closing a pension fund into a private equity fund like ours. But, they're now participants on the advisory committee and they bring a lot of value add, along with, all value add we get of having such high level DFIs is a part. And we have a local DFI as well as the international DFIs. So it's difficult. I mean, as we were, all this data that was coming through CAF and others, it's still difficult and challenging to get them to sign on the bottom line and put the cash in.
Thank you, Pamela, for this answer. I suppose I will put the question to you. I know that Characterize now is at a phase where, very soon that you'll be looking to diversify your investor base. Again, I guess putting the same question in terms of your strategy. What approach will you be taking when in different markets in different regions in Africa? What approach will you be taking in order to attract pension funds to invest in some of the pipeline of the projects that you have?
I think as far back 2014, it became clear that the capital that was coming to us from DFI was going to be wholly inadequate to meet what the market needs requires. It's clear that we had to devise a strategy for getting in quite a lot of capital from the market. And therefore, I think at the core of our strategy was a couple of things. The first was really achieving investment grade rating institutions. So all the organization's strategy, its actions were focused on achieving a rating level that would give our pension funds, particularly court, to invest their money with us. So that was actually quite central the strategy. Around that, of course, is then developing more sectors of the market we are going to focus on, and particularly looking to de-risk our pipeline. And in the strategy that our board approved in December 2017, has been a decisive move in terms of the institution's lending program towards governments supported housing projects. So these housing schemes for workers, housing schemes that are kind of promoted by cooperatives, but essentially housing schemes where the market risk was significantly lower than the kind of pipeline that we had been financing in the past. So those were the two key strategies that we had employed. We had a long-standing relationship with DFI, so they were already in. But the key money was always going to come from the capital markets. and it was clear that the strategy for bringing that capital in was providing credit comfort.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of wrap it up there. There was a few questions that came in, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But what we will try to do is we will try to address all the questions through some of the communications, either by email or through our website. So I want to thank Serena for her presentation, and also Pam and Femi for their contribution. I also want to thank the audience for sticking around with us until the end. Finally, please, we'd like to remind you not to forget to fill out the survey right after this. So thank you all for your time, and until next time, I wish you all a pleasant afternoon, evening, day, wherever you are. Goodbye.